So, back in early 2022, everyone was watching, holding their breath. The expectation that one of the world's biggest armies was about to roll over a European capital in just a few days. But that's not what happened, not even close. This is the incredible story of the battle for Kyiv, and it's easily one of the biggest military upsets we've seen this century. So let's get into it and figure out how this all went down.
On paper, the Russian plan seemed brutally simple. A lightning-fast strike to basically cut the head off the government and force a quick surrender. They were thinking, hey, 72 hours, tops. But the reality on the ground? It was a completely different story. Ukraine, its government, its people, they just refused to break. So the big question is, how did a plan that was so confident go so wrong?
Well, it all comes back to this idea of Russia's three-day war. The entire operation, and I mean the whole thing, was built on a pile of really flawed assumptions. And those flaws, they turned out to be fatal. Okay, so February 24th, that's the day it all kicks off. First, a huge wave of airstrikes hits Ukrainian air defenses and bases all over the country. And right after that, ground forces start pouring in from the north, the northeast, and the south. And they all have one big prize in mind, Kyiv. The whole idea was to be so fast, so overwhelming, that there'd be no time to react. Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating. These points right here, these are the core miscalculations that pretty much doomed the whole thing from the get-go. Russian intelligence was convinced the Ukrainian government would just pack up and run. They thought the public would basically welcome them, and that the army would just collapse. And because they believed all that, their supply lines were set up for a victory parade, not a real war. Every single one of those assumptions, totally, catastrophically wrong.
And this right here, this quote just perfectly captures that first massive miscalculation. President Zelensky gets offered a way out, a ride to safety, and his response becomes this legendary rallying cry all over the world. His decision to stay put, right there in Kyiv, it just lit a fire under the whole nation. The message was crystal clear. We are not running, we're going to fight.
So, the first big play for the capital city wasn't actually with tanks on the ground. Nope, it was in the air. Russia decided to kick things off with a super audacious, high-risk helicopter assault to grab a key airport right on the edge of Kyiv. This was going to be the opening act, the first major showdown.
And the plan, it was bold. You have to give them that. Step 1, a whole swarm of attack helicopters drops off their elite VDV paratroopers at Antonov Airport. Step 2, they secure the airport fast. The goal was to create what's called an air bridge. They give it like a highway in the sky, so they could fly in thousands and thousands more troops and heavy gear for that final push into Kyiv. This was the absolute key to their whole three-day war idea.
But then, something happens that nobody saw coming. The airport wasn't defended by elite special forces. It was a pretty small group of Ukrainian National Guard, and a lot of them were just young conscripts. And when one of these guys takes a shoulder-fired missile and brings down a state-of-the-art Russian attack helicopter, everything changes. In that one moment, the entire feel of the battle just shifts. Suddenly, the impossible didn't seem so impossible anymore.
And what happens next is just wild. Even after they're forced to fall back, the Ukrainian defenders call in artillery on their own positions. Their jets come in and bomb the runway to tear it up. Then their ground troops launch this ferocious counterattack. By the time the dust settles, Russia's elite paratroopers are hiding in the woods. And that crucial runway? It's so chewed up that the air bridge, the centerpiece of the entire invasion plan, is totally useless. Plan A is officially dead.
Okay, so with the whole air assault plan completely wrecked, Russia has to go to plan B, their massive ground invasion. But this giant armored beast, this colossus, it pretty quickly gets stuck. Its huge power just gets swallowed up by mud, by the terrain, and by some really smart Ukrainian tactics.
And this right here really shows you the problem. You had the Russian forces moving in these long, unprotected columns, almost like they were in a parade, and they were stuck on the roads. But the Ukrainian landscape at that time of year, it was a defender's paradise. You've got thick forest for ambushes, rivers that act as natural walls, and, this is a big one, the weather got warm, which turned all the fields into deep, thick mud. So those big columns had nowhere to go but the roads, creating these perfect, predictable kill zones.
And that, of course, leads us to that infamous 40-mile-long convoy. The Ukrainian tactic was just brilliant in its simplicity. They'd use weapons like javelins to knock out the first vehicle in the column and the last one. And just like that, everything in between, dozens, sometimes hundreds of tanks and trucks, is completely trapped. The whole thing just becomes a massive, stationary target for artillery, day after day.
So, you're probably wondering, how on earth did a much smaller, outnumbered force pull this off? Well, they used a classic military strategy, but they adapted it perfectly for their situation. It's called asymmetric defense, and it's all about turning your weaknesses into your greatest strengths.
The core idea is something called trading space for time. It's pretty much what it sounds like. Instead of trying to fight a big head-on battle they knew they couldn't win, they'd pull back, but they'd make the enemy fight for every single inch. They give up ground slowly, which made the Russian army stretch its supply lines thinner and thinner, and forced them into these awful, grinding street fights for every little town.
And they executed this strategy with a really smart playbook. You can see the key points here. First, they set up 2 big rings of defense around Kyiv. They gave local commanders the freedom to make their own calls, which was crucial. They used these small, fast-moving teams with anti-tank missiles to just terrorize the Russian supply columns. And of course, they blew up bridges and used their home turf advantage to set up some absolutely brutal ambushes.
So all of this, the stalled convoy, the ambushes, the whole strategy, it all comes to a head in these incredibly desperate and brutal battles in the suburbs just outside the capital. The fate of Kyiv, maybe the whole country, was going to be decided in these small towns the world was about to learn the names of. Places like Irpin, Bucha, and one tiny, critical village called Moshchin.
Now, the fighting in places like Irpin and Bucha was absolutely horrific and so important. But if you ask military experts and the commanders who were there, they'll all point to one specific battle as the turning point, the fight for this little village of Moshchin. Today, they call it the battle that saved Kyiv.
And the odds they were facing, they were just insane. Look at this chart. It gives you an idea of what they were up against. For every 1 artillery shell that Ukrainians could fire, the Russians could fire 20. Just imagine that. They were being pounded by a truly unbelievable amount of firepower.
Yeah, the stakes just couldn't get any higher. The message from Ukraine's top general, Zaluzhny, to his soldiers on the ground was simple. You do not retreat. Because, as he put it, if Moshchun falls, Kyiv falls. And if Kyiv falls, we could lose the whole war. It was that simple.
So how in the world did they hold on? Well, this is where it gets into tactical genius territory. Just as the Russians managed to get a foothold across the Irpin River, Ukrainian special forces went and blew up a nearby dam. The river floods, just swells up and turns the whole area into a giant, impassable swamp. The Russian troops that were already across the river, they were completely cut off from their reinforcements, from their heavy gear. It allowed the outnumbered Ukrainian defenders to hold them, contain them, and, in the end, defeat them.
And that victory at Moshchun, that was basically the final nail in the coffin for the whole Russian assault on Kyiv. It was the last straw after a month of nothing but failures. What was supposed to be a lightning-fast victory had turned into a complete and humiliating defeat. So by the end of March, there was just no denying it. The Russian advance was dead in the water, and their losses were staggering. So they announced they were pulling out of the entire Kyiv region, calling it a gesture of goodwill. But everybody knew what it really was, a full-blown retreat. The battle for Kyiv was over.
Look, it is impossible to overstate how huge this victory was. It wasn't just about saving a city, it was about saving the entire country. It completely shattered that myth of the invincible Russian army. It proved to the world just how deadly modern anti-tank weapons could be in the right hands. And it forced Russia to totally abandon its main goal, which set the stage for the completely different kind of war we'd see happen next.
Yeah, military historians are going to be studying the defense of Kyiv for a long, long time. It was an incredible win, born from defiance, clever tactics, and just raw courage against unbelievable odds. But it's also important to remember, this amazing success in the north really just marked the end of the first chapter. It forced both sides to dig in for the much longer, much more grueling war of attrition that was still to come.